So we often try to control the uncontrollable. When something isn't controllable, we spend a lot of time trying to figure out how to change that. When we finally come to the realization that it may possibly be uncontrollable, we immediately try to explain it. It's God's doing. Or it was just wasn't meant to be. Or when the time comes, it just must not be time for me. All these are ways to explain and cope with the uncontrollable. But why do we do that? Why is it so hard for us to accept it? That there's no order in chaos. Well, for one, we're hardwired against it. Our brains are constantly trying to fix things. I mean, it's what it's built to do. Which is also why we can't perceive truly random things. Our brains just can't do it. It's easy to prove. Alright, so let's say we flip a coin 10 times. And the outcomes are going to be truly random. If I told you to guess what the outcome was going to be overall, you'd probably say a certain percentage of heads versus a certain amount of tails would come up. And while you would be right, if the outcome was truly random, you would be equally as right to say that it would be all heads or all tails. But our brains tell us that that's near impossible. Therefore, the odds say it would be some mix of the two. But a true answer, if the odds are truly random, is any answer would be right, including heads 10 times in a row. It's why when people pick lottery tickets, they don't pick 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, because they just can't wrap their head around the fact that that's just as likely to come up as any other number. But if you're the Pope, and follow me here, if you're the Pope and the Emperor swears his allegiance to the church that you're the head of, doesn't that give you complete control? And if so, when you see disorder and chaos, isn't it your sworn duty to exert control and put things back in order? And if that's true, at what point is the chaos beyond your control? All right, let's take this a step further. Let's say you're God. I mean, surely God can bring order to chaos. It's kind of his whole thing. So if he can do that, and you're the physical embodiment of him, then doesn't that mean you have the exact same power? Do you see how this can keep twisting in and out of rational logic? Of course you do. Because you're intelligent. And you can think in a logical way. But in my opinion, the major reason that you can see the pitfalls in this line of thinking, or I can see the pitfalls in this line of thinking, is because nobody is making claims of power about us. You're removed from the situation in that aspect because no one is saying that you're the representative of God or the leader of the church or God on earth himself. In fact, for those who are Christian believers out there, fallacy is built in. The Bible doesn't tell you to be Christ. It tells you to be Christ-like. Because you're expected to fall short because you are not Christ. You know, your desire should always be to be better. And so because of this, falling short is okay. It's expected that it will happen. And when it does happen, you will be forgiven for it. It's kind of the same way you tell your children, at least I tell mine, But when they've done something wrong, just tell the truth. The punishment won't be as bad. You see, because as adults, we understand that mistakes are going to happen. That's how you learn. That's how you grow. And whether that's growing into adulthood or growing closer to the goal of being more Christ-like in the Christian faith, you'll stumble, you'll fall. But if you own your mistakes and you work not to repeat them, they are forgiven, and we learn and move on, right? See, Pope Boniface VIII was kind of like us in a way. By all accounts, he was very intelligent, a logical man. But once he became Pope, it seems like his ability to see the fallacy in the line of thinking that he can control the uncontrollable, and that he, and only he, can fix the wrongs of the country, the empire, the world, the lines started to blur. And unlike other popes, he's not really one to indulge in pleasures of the flesh and the things that he wants to do like they did. No, see, Boniface isn't known as a pope that slaughtered his people. He wasn't Pope Joffrey that got handed the papacy. He worked his way up. The problem with what Pope Boniface VIII did is he starts to believe the hype. And me being a fan of Public Enemy, if that's taught me one thing, it's to don't believe the hype. From the mouth of Chuck D to my ears, I learned a long time ago not to believe the hype. And I've always kept that concept in mind. See, Boniface VIII, he doesn't have the gospel of Chuck D. He doesn't have the wisdom of Flavor of the Flav. No. He believed the hype. Born, and I'm going to butcher this, but y'all know, we've been talking about this. He's born Benedetto Gaetani in 1230. And he's born in a family that they have a connection to the papacy, but it's kind of removed a little. Like his mother was the niece of a pope. But as I said, like he's not like Pope Joffrey. He doesn't get handed everything. And now, in the interest of not being here for 7 hours and boring you to death with his resume, let's just say that it's extensive. And I'll say this. He starts at a young age, and he goes through various secretary jobs and a ton of legal jobs for the papacy and the church. And he rises through the ranks quickly. And he's constantly being called in to advise on a dispute here, or to review the law in that decree, or, any matter like that. He's for sure touched almost every office in some way on the way up. And he's definitely worked. And you can see this before he becomes Pope. He writes about his time in a certain place, or the love of a certain town. But when he gets to the top, Pope Boniface VIII flies too close to the sun. And suffice it to say that when he reaches the point of advising the Pope that's before him, he knows the papal law chapter and verse. He knows how to play the political game. He's an expert. Like a true-to-life expert when it comes to papal law. And as he becomes the advisor to the Pope, he's next to a humble man who was a hermit, who had no knowledge of how things worked on the inside. He wasn't good at politics, and to be honest, he didn't even want to be there. And Pope Boniface VIII eats him alive. You see, we'll touch on this real quickly, but the Pope that came before Boniface VIII was a man named Pietro, who later goes on to become Pope Celestine V. And Pietro never wanted to be Pope anyway. In fact, before he becomes Celestine V, he wasn't even nominated. See, by all accounts at the time, he's a hermit living a very, very simple life, devoted to God, and that's his main focus. He's a God-fearing man. And at the time, Pope Nicholas IV dies, leaving the papacy vacant. But for a man like Pietro, who's going to come next he's on pins and needles. He's just got to know. He's worried about, this is a part of, he lives his life in the church, by the church, for the church. And the man who's going to lead that church, who's going to become the physical representation of Christ, like this, he needs to know. All right, now at the time, we have to kind of do a little homework here and understand that at the time, it's not like today where when the Pope dies, all the cardinals meet, they go into a conclave, they lock down, and they don't leave until a Pope is elected. Now, at the time when the Pope died, if you were a cardinal, you mailed your vote in, basically. So when Nicholas dies, Nicholas IV dies, and the world waits to hear who's going to be elected. And 2 years pass. The cardinals, most of which know old Quicksilver here, it's a little Marvel joke for y'all. Pietro is at a monastery and he's concerned, and all the cardinals have kind of met him. They've been, they stay there when they come through town. But Pietro writes a letter to the head of the College of Cardinals, and basically what the letter says is that he's concerned. It's been 2 years. And if they don't elect a pope soon, they may face God's wrath. God's not going to be pleased by this vacancy. And the head of the College of Cardinals is an elderly man who is sick, and this is a lot of stress, and this has been going on for 2 years. And finally goes, you know what? I nominate Pietro. At which point, all the cardinals, having known who he is, that he's a simple man and a good dude, they nominate and elect him pope. And as a man of service, when he gets the call, even though it's not what he wants to do, he accepts. But understand, he doesn't even go to Rome. Pietro here sets up his monastery as the home of the Pope. And Boniface is basically left in Rome as the chief advisor. So when the Pope sends a message in, or an order or a decree, it comes into Rome to Boniface, and it's his job to enforce this new law or this papal decree or whatever that's going on. But Boniface is a political tactician at this point. And I have to believe he smells blood in the water. Now, if Pope Celestine V, when he leaves, I mean, Boniface is kind of the heir apparent. But in 5 months after the man who didn't want to be Pope is elected, he's gone. And I'll say this, Pope Celestine V, he's not a good Pope. And not because he's not a good man. But he doesn't move to Rome, and he's weak in position. He doesn't understand the game. He even goes on to admit this in his resignation. But his orders that are being sent into Rome, Boniface is in charge of enforcing them, and they're not being enforced. They're being ignored, or they're just outright disobeyed. The kings of the time don't respect him. He truly doesn't understand how politics works. He hates it. He just wants to be back in the monastery living his old life. But throughout the years, the ability of a pope to abdicate has been instated into papal law, and then it's removed. And then it's reinstated, and then it's removed. So it's very far from a settled matter. And as we know from our last show, the Pope can even abdicate. At this point, it's a question as to can the Pope abdicate and then turn around and decide he didn't want to. And so Celestine V he's in a jam. He doesn't want this. He wants out. But at first, he's going to have to settle this matter of, can the Pope abdicate? If only there was a papal law expert around that could clear that up for him. That's right. Celestine V, he's forgettable, and I don't expect you to remember anything about him, but if you do, it should be these two things. In the 5 months he's there, there's only 2 of his decrees that are actually fully enforced and go down as papal law, even until today. The first is he sets up the cardinal conclave so that there's never a 2-year break between popes again, which is where the ceremony now that we get to watch when it happens and all the cardinals come to Rome and they lock down, that's set up here. The second thing that he does as Pope is he puts into papal law that the Pope can abdicate and step down. And he lays out the steps and how you're supposed to do this and the legal ramifications, and all of this are set with the help of Boniface, of course. And here's the crazy thing. When it comes to the abdication, a week after that's set into law, he does it. He steps down. And he cites the papal law that allows it. And no pope does that again for 719 years until Benedict XVI in 2013. But Celestine V's out of the way, and here we are. It's Christmas Eve, 1294. And Boniface VIII is now Pope. Now, he hasn't been consecrated yet, but he has been elected. And already he's at work. He's setting a tone, and he's working at a blistering pace. So before his consecration, a month later, he starts to revoke a ton of appointments by the 2 popes that came before him. He's deposing archbishops and bishops. He's doing so without the consent of the cardinals, which he's not supposed to do. He packs up his entire court and moves it to Rome because he wants his people around him. Now, Boniface VIII is known as a man who has no patience for opposition. He has an autocratic temper, and he goes into violent rages. And up to this point, Boniface probably would have been fine. But the world's changing. We're on the dawn of the Renaissance. Kings are starting to question the church's contributions to their own countries. In fact, people are starting to think more about countries. See, at this time, it wasn't uncommon for a large city to basically have its own king and a little bit of land, and everybody was just kind of divided up. The concept of everybody uniting under one banner, we are this country, and this is our leader, and he sets the rules, and this is how this goes, is starting to come into play. Again, the world's changing. Common people are starting to think more scientifically. The arts are on the rise. Logical way of thinking is becoming big. As I said, we're on the door to the Renaissance, and Boniface VIII can't see it. It's a time of change, but the man who's in control is way behind the times. But walking in the door, having deposed all of these bishops and archbishops, he's kind of created a divide in the church. Excuse me. He imprisons Celestine V immediately. And I know what you're thinking, like, Celestine was a hermit, good dude. You know, why did he imprison him? Well, Boniface was afraid with this division happening amongst the cardinals that some of the cardinals may reinstate Celestine V because they're not certain if he can abdicate. You know, it's kind of sketchy that he abdicates and provides the legal basis from the guy who's now Pope. Yeah. But Boniface, to make sure that he's not undermined, he has Celestine arrested, and basically he arrests him, he puts him up in a hotel with 2 monks to take care of him, and he forgets about him. And at age 81, just 1 year later, Celestine V dies. And people start whispering that Boniface had something to do with it. And that alone would be a major scandal to have to do something about politically. He'd have to address it. But he can't. You see, Boniface is now trying to handle the divided cardinals, the split in the church. But immediately, when he comes in, he also starts having trouble with the King of Germany, France, England, Denmark, Sicily. He also gets on the bad side of Dante, the famous Italian poet. Boniface works quick, I told you. So we'll start with Dante, just to kind of give you a little taste, a little soupçon, if you will, of what's to come. Because like I told you, the world's changing. Things are happening fast. And Boniface is trying to control the uncontrollable. 1297, Cardinal Jacopo changes his will. And basically, he changes the family will. He cuts 3 of his brothers out of it. He takes their land and he pushes them aside. So the brothers plead to Boniface to stop this and to restore it the way it was. And Dante was in the mix with these families and all this as this happens. To the point that Dante even goes to Rome. And later, when he writes, Dante puts Boniface in the, I think it's the 7th or 8th level of hell. And you have to understand, he wasn't doing this as talking about a leader that he didn't know. Dante knew him. He had lived there for like a year with him. But the family, anyway, goes to Boniface and says, like, hey, he's cut us out of the will. This is not the way the will was written. He's taken our land. We want it back. And Boniface, who has all these troubles to worry about, takes this on too. And again, there's a lot of themes here, but this one's a big one with Boniface. He just can't stay out of a fight. This is a prime example. We all know you never intervene in a fight between siblings. My personal experience, sisters are the worst. When 2 sisters are fighting, it is a fool's errand to try to get involved. But the same goes for brothers. But he gets involved. He can't help himself. So he tells Jacopo to give the land back, as well as the castles of Colonna, Palestrina, and some other towns. And Jacopo says no. And when you add in that he and his nephew are tight with the enemies of the Pope in Sicily, this is a bad look. And Boniface, being a man who can't wrap his head around even hesitating to follow the Pope's demands, just hesitating, an outright no drives him nuts. So Boniface sends the papal army to intervene and take the towns. And it had been a negotiated surrender where the families say that the deal was struck, that they would surrender, they would hand the places over, Boniface would then leave. No harm to the cities, no harm to the people. But instead, Boniface has the cities burned to the ground and salts the earth. Yeah. He did it anyway. Even after promising not to get involved with a petty family dispute. Again, there's a lot going on. Boniface plans to handle all of it. Now, at the same time, he's very aware that he has a problem in the church. There's a lot of cardinals, archbishops, bishops that his predecessors have left, and they don't seem to be falling in line the way he'd like. And he's going to have to clean this up if he has any chance of handling all the other problems. So he starts deposing cardinals left and right and handpicking replacements. And wouldn't you know it, those seats are being filled by who? His family. I told you before, he wants his people around him. But that just makes more enemies of the cardinals that remain. But Boniface doesn't have time for this. Again, there's a lot going on, and he feels he has to address all of it. There's a war in Sicily about who's going to be king. He jumps straight into that. England is at war with Scotland. Mel Gibson is giving King Charles I of England a run for his money. He's got his face painted blue. He's wearing a kilt. The whole thing. You saw it. But we know that in the end, King Charles of England runs through William Wallace of Scotland. But see, Scotland, realizing that they can't beat England in a fight, appealed to Boniface VIII. And they claim that since the country is Catholic, it should be ruled by the Pope. They always followed the Pope's teachings, his laws. So you should be the ruler of Scotland. So tell the King of England that the papacy controls Scotland, that he's taken papal land. And Boniface agrees. He sends word to Charles to give Scotland back because they're under papal rule. It's papal lands. He's not going to prosecute him for attacking the church, but give Scotland back. And Charles and the English people find this laughable. And they say no. They say no to giving the lands back. They say no to Scotland being controlled by the papacy. They say that wasn't the case and it never has been. And they're not going to do it. They're not giving it back. And they go so far as to even pass law to say that even if the King of England, Charles I, wanted to go to Rome and explain what's up and give the lands back, the people of England wouldn't allow it. Yeah. So what are you to do if you're Boniface at this point? Because at the same time as this is happening, France and England are also on the verge of war. And this is a problem for the church. Both are contributors to the church's coffers. Now, I'm not going to get into the whole why France and England were arguing, but suffice it to say, it was really petty. And there was a lot of the King of England said that the King of France wasn't legitimate because blah, blah, blah. And then the King of France got mad and said, no, mine's bigger. The whole thing. But either way, with war looming between England and France, both kings, King Charles I, King Philip IV, and trust me, remember that name, you're going to hear it a lot. They both are taxing the clergy because they need to finance their war. Now, it's against papal law, but up until this point, the church kind of overlooked it, as long as the country is engaging in a just war. The problem here is both kings are claiming it's a just war. And see, this is where things really begin to go south. Hard. Because Boniface puts out a papal bull. And in it, he claims that the kings have always treated the church wrong and disrespectfully. And he bans all taxation of any kind on clergy members without the approval of the Pope. If you're going to take money from any clergy member, I have to approve it first. And anybody that does so, anybody that enforces taxes on clergy without the expressed written consent of the Pope and the NFL, well, they're excommunicated. Done. And again, keep in mind that at this time being excommunicated, up until this point, That's the worst thing that can happen to you, even if you're a king. So anybody would stop cold with the threat of excommunication. But see, again, times are changing. Especially King Philip IV of France. He could care less what Boniface has to say. So he answers with a demand of his own. And basically says that that's fine if I can't tax the church. And mind you, the churches that I'm taxing are located in my country, and I'm taxing them because I'm raising money to fight a war against England. If I can't tax them and basically charge them for protection, then they're not allowed to export any money out of France at all. See, King Philip IV, say what you will about him, he's a smart guy. And he has the world's greatest talents around him. He's got the thinkers. He's got lawyers. And these are the people that are advising him. So while the church is raking money in France, at the same time it's doing them no good, because now Rome can't get to it. They can't physically bring the silver to Rome. And Boniface's answer here is, he's in a tough spot. He's got to do something. He's got to say something. You know, he can't just let this go. But there's a lot of stuff that he's having issues with. That demands his attention. He needs the money, for sure. But he can't get to it. You know, he's going to have these issues with Philip repeatedly. You know, this weaves in and out of his life constantly. So, with King Philip IV of France being a smart dude surrounded by smart people, and Boniface sitting in Rome unable to access the money that his churches are dragging in, Boniface answers by telling Philip that the problem with this situation is you're king, but you think you're above the Pope. And because you think that, it shows that you're a fool, because no one's above the Pope. But at the same time, this is the main source of income for France. So eventually Boniface gives in. And this is big. Because while France is raising money to fund a war with England, the church is also raising money for yet another crusade. The church can't afford to play this game. But Boniface giving in here is huge, because it does a couple things. First, it validates that maybe blindly following the church isn't the way to go, because the church isn't always right. Secondly, the Pope is supposed to be the Word of God. He's supposed to be the representation on earth of God. And God doesn't backpedal. And God definitely doesn't make a mistake. And he wouldn't create a mistake that would require him to admit that he's wrong. That's what Boniface does. So that would mean that it's possible that the Pope is fallible. And if the Pope is fallible, then that would also mean that God is. And I bring this up now because this issue grows and spreads and becomes a major issue in Boniface's death. So make sure to stick to the end, because you're going to love it. But in this moment, the issue's resolved. Boniface gives, Philip can tax the church, and in return, Philip lifts the blockade from the Trade Federation and the Phantom Menace. Philip also accepts Boniface's offer to mediate between England and France. Boniface can't stay out of things. So he wants to be the middleman to negotiate peace. Think of how great that will look. The Pope strolls into these warring countries, and then when he leaves, everybody's happy. But Philip agrees to allow Boniface to be the mediator. And oddly enough, when decisions need to happen, he tends to go toward France. And so, of course, Philip and Boniface live happily ever after this. Not a chance. See, now it's all out. Because Philip IV has the Pope's representative in France arrested on charges of inciting an insurrection. The Pope's representative is tried and convicted in French courts because, you see, it turns out that even in 1300, walking around bad-mouthing the king and telling people that they should do something about it because the king's trying to steal the country from the people, and it's clearly an attempt to overthrow the government. So Philip arrests him, because that's what you do to insurrectionists. Now, Boniface here is in a really tough spot, because Philip's now arrested his representative. And Boniface is well aware and even admits that his representative was towing the line of insurrection, but at the same time, that's a church representative, and only the church should be the one to police their people. It's that whole insane idea that we'll police ourselves. We'll investigate ourselves. So Boniface can't let this go. He sends out a papal bull to Philip. And a papal bull is basically just a proclamation. It's a law, but it's written down. But he sends it to Philip, and he tells him that Philip, even though he's king of France, he doesn't have the authority to try church members and put them in jail. He can't hold a court investigation or a trial in royal courts. And he especially can't do, this is the kicker, he especially can't do it if he's taxing them. So Boniface tells Philip that he'll instruct his bishops and abbots in France to take measures against Philip because he has to protect the church and the interest of the church. And Philip, in getting this papal bull, burns it publicly. That's Philip's response. Boniface is at his wit's end at this point. He sends another representative, only now the representative coming from Rome and speaking on behalf of Boniface, he's not asking anymore. He's telling. Boniface tells him to go to France and to assert control over the king. It's time that the church flexes a little. See, Philip does something very smart here. For the first time, seeing that times are changing, having his finger on the pulse. See, Philip convenes a council, but it's not just any council. This council, all classes are representative, from the very top all the way down to the common man. And he asks them what to do about this. What do we do about Boniface VIII? He's a problem in Rome. He keeps trying to exert control over France, but I'm trying to make France its own sovereign nation, and I'm the king. So what do we do? And they all agree to tell the Pope to get over himself. And not only that, but Philip decides coming out of this council to block certain people from going to Rome, because as this is happening, the Pope is wanting to convene a council of his own. And Philip feels that anybody that he lets go to Rome is just going to go and help plan with the Pope against him. So he blocks it. And again, you have to keep in mind, France and England at this point are at war. Full stop. Church is trying to raise money for a crusade. The world's shifting away from blind faith and moving towards enlightened thinking and logical reasoning. Before, the church's answer to the question why was because. But that's not good enough anymore. And now remember, Boniface has already decreed that anybody who does this or tries to block anything that the Pope commands will be excommunicated. But see, Boniface again sees that Philip of France has him over a barrel. And can't keep going back on his word and showing that he may be wrong. That's just going to enforce that possibly the Pope is fallible. So Boniface tries to navigate this without hitting any landmines. He puts out another papal bull called the Unum Sanctum. And it says that everyone, including kings, are subordinate to the Roman Pope. God has put him in control of the church. The church should be in control of the kings. End of story. But understanding the situation and being good at politics, Boniface sends a cardinal as his representative to Philip. And basically what the cardinal tells him is this. Boniface checked the math. He did some research. And he found out that even though he said everyone would be excommunicated, it turns out that the Pope, and the Pope therefore through this cardinal, he's imbued him with the power to exclude King Philip from this excommunication. Now, at the same time of offering this olive branch, Boniface VIII has had enough. This has got to stop. So he puts out another order, and he basically says he's excommunicating anyone who has ever impeded French clergy from coming to Rome. And this includes the king, but not by name. He's kind of like an unindicted co-conspirator at this point. But it does, however, cover the king's chief minister, and he's pissed. So the chief minister in France sets out on a press tour, basically where he goes around and just bashes the Pope. He trashes him in the press, but he doesn't print retractions. He's just on him. He even goes so far as to call the Pope a criminal outright in public. And this is where the shit hits the fan, pardon my French. See, the Pope decides to tell the king he's had enough. And so, here's what's going to happen. Because I'm the Pope and I say so. I'm going to suspend the rights of everyone, including the king, to appoint any position in the church at all. From priest to regent, I don't care. The king's power has a limit. I am limiting it. Here it is. You're suspended. And it's going to stay that way until King Philip comes to Rome and explains himself. Now, I don't know how much you know about kings. But if it's not a lot, let me enlighten you on a little something. See, there are two things that kings get off on. They absolutely love. And that's people demanding things of them. And that's having to explain themselves. So, the Pope demands him to come to Rome and explain himself. Well, ask and ye shall receive. Philip sends his army. His army is led by his minister who hates the Pope. And another guy who's kind of like the head of a powerful French family. And in response, the Pope finally, publicly, officially excommunicates King Philip and his minister, Nogaret. Because that'll teach him. So Nogaret and Colonna, who is the head of that noble family, under orders from the king, direct orders. This doesn't mean that King Philip wrote them a letter in French and said, hey, have a nice day. By the way, I'd like you to do this. No, he told them to their faces, attack Boniface VIII. And they take the palace. And they arrest Boniface and they demand that he abdicate. You know, since he wrote the rules. Like he literally wrote the book on popes abdicating. And Boniface tells him he'd rather die. And Colonna, the guy from the family, slaps the Pope. But it's not just any slap. Literally in the books, it's listed as the slap that goes down in history. Do you know how hard you have to slap somebody to make it historical? So anyway, they hold Boniface for 3 days. They beat him nearly to death. They sack his palace. They take any treasures or anything of value. Now, by the third day, it's said that Boniface looks out his window, seeing them sack the palace, and said, "The Lord giveth, and he taketh away." And shortly after, the people of the town, not real pleased that there's an invading force here, kind of rise up and they run the French representatives out of town. But the damage is done. The Pope's been beaten nearly to death. And he's on the run. They take him back to Rome, where Pope Boniface VIII dies a month later. But see, Philip isn't done yet. Not even death can save Boniface VIII from King Philip of France. Boniface VIII is succeeded by a man who goes on to become Pope Clement V. And he is a puppet to Philip. Philip pressures him to put Boniface on trial, even though he's dead. And he wants him put on trial for heresy. Now, Clement does this, but he understands that this is a major, major, major problem for the church. You see, if Boniface is put on trial and convicted, found guilty by the church, then the church is admitting that the Pope was not infallible in matters of faith and morals. And being the representative of Christ, the physical embodiment even, then that would mean that Christ is fallible as well. And if Christ is fallible as well, that would mean God is too. You see, Clement understands the gravity of this situation. He's a man who really rises to the moment. Because he's staring at the entire religion falling apart. But the other explanation would be that the Pope didn't act as God's voice, and maybe he made the decisions as a man and not the vicar of Christ. And that's still not much better. So Clement has to stop this. He's got to do it, and he's got to do it quick. So here's what he does. He pardons the king's minister and King Philip as well, and retracts their excommunications, and basically tells them, you're not excommunicated anymore, but your minister, since we know he's really good at fighting, we happen to have a crusade going on and we're recruiting. So I'll let you off the hook, but you have to go fight in the crusade for a little bit. And as this trial is going on, as Boniface VIII is being put on trial, and the trial's going on, Clement's patience with this whole thing starts to wear thin, because he can see that there are parts of this that are a complete sham. And the people can see it as well. Like, anybody who's ever had a problem with Boniface VIII, you know, whether it's money or he stepped on their toe or he didn't give them a piece of bubble gum, whatever, they're all showing up for this trial and airing their grievances. And knowing the gravity of this situation, Clement basically sets out to stop the trial. So he issues a mandate and says that anybody that shows up and is found making outrageous claims is going to be excommunicated if they don't have some semblance of proof. He's going to excommunicate them for perjury. Now, when he does that, King Philip sends more people with more claims, from heresy to sodomy and everything in between. And Clement starts to feel like he's seen this movie before. This seems real familiar. Because it is. See, the charges that Philip is leveling at Boniface VIII, and the way he's doing it, is the exact same way that he did the Templars. Now, what do? Because the entire religion hangs in the balance. So Clement knows this is a problem, and he's got to shift this completely to his control. So he basically posts a bull saying that he forgives King Philip of everything he ever said about Boniface VIII, ever. Because, as it turns out, when the king was saying that bad stuff about Boniface, he was doing so with good intentions. It just came out wrong. And he convinces Philip that, I'm going to handle the trial. You go back to France and take care of business there. And don't worry about it. I got you. I know why you're mad. I'm going to make sure this goes through. And Philip leaves. Turns the whole deal over to Clement, who immediately decrees that the ultimate decision of guilt is going to come down to him, and only him. When the main part of the trial begins, a couple cardinals come to speak about how moral the dead pope was, and how he wasn't that bad. He's a good dude. Then the most metal thing of all happens. 2 knights show up to defend Boniface's honor. And the way they do this is they go into the trial, they throw their gauntlets down, and they challenge anybody trying to prosecute Boniface of being guilty of any of these claims. They challenge him to a trial by combat. And knowing that no one's heart's really into this that much, he's dead, he's gone, this is getting kind of silly, nobody accepts. And the cardinals and Clement consider the matter closed. So again, how do you control the uncontrollable? Maybe you shouldn't. I want to thank everybody for listening. The response has been outstanding. If you're watching on YouTube, like and subscribe. Come back next week where we talk about a pope who is so vile he would complain when cardinals weren't screaming loud enough when he was having them tortured. So you're not going to want to miss that. I'm David Van Dyke. I'll see y'all next week.